Lecture speech applying Gerard Genette's narrative theory to the novel by Dr. Shaneen Shahrazad. Good morning, everyone. Today we will examine how Gerard Genette's narrative theory can be applied to the analysis of the novel. Rather than approaching narrative simply as a story that unfolds, Genette proposes a set of analytical distinctions that allow us to understand how stories are structured, organized, and communicated to the reader. To illustrate these concepts, we will refer to several canonical novels. As we discuss each concept, consider not only the example itself, but also how the technique influences the reader's interpretation of the narrative. 1. Story, narrative, narration. Let us begin with one of Genette's most fundamental distinctions, the difference between story, narrative, and narration. Genette uses the term story, histoire, to refer to the chronological sequence of events that occur in the fictional world. In other words, if we rearranged all events in the exact order in which they actually happened within the story world, we would obtain the story. The narrative recit, by contrast, is the textual presentation of those events. It is the way the events are organized, structured, and presented within the literary work. Finally, narration refers to the act of telling the story. It concerns who is speaking, from what position, and under what circumstances the story is being narrated. A useful example appears in the novel Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. If we consider the story, it revolves around the intense and destructive relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine, as well as the consequences that their passions produce for the next generation. However, the narrative does not present these events in a straightforward chronological order. Instead, the events are revealed gradually through different narrative layers. The narration occurs through two narrators. First, we encounter Mr. Lockwood, an outsider who arrives at the estate and begins recounting what he observes. Then, much of the story is told by Nellie Dean, the housekeeper, who recounts past events to Lockwood. Thus, the reader receives the story indirectly through embedded narration. This layered narrative structure demonstrates precisely how Genette's distinction between story, narrative, and narration operates in practice. Number 2, order, the temporal arrangement of events. Another important concept in Genette's theory concerns order, which refers to the relationship between the chronological sequence of events and the order in which those events are narrated. Narratives frequently disrupt chronological order through two primary techniques, analepsis and prolepsis. Analepsis, flashback, and analepsis occurs when the narrative moves backward in time to recount earlier events. A well-known example appears in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. In this novel, the narrator is the adult Jane Eyre, who recounts the events of her childhood. Although the story begins with her as a child, the act of narration occurs later in her life, when she is able to reflect on her earlier experiences. This creates a retrospective perspective. The mature narrator revisits childhood suffering, her life at Gateshead, her experiences at Lowood, with greater understanding and emotional distance. Thus, the narrative incorporates internal analepsis, allowing past events to be interpreted through the consciousness of the adult narrator. If analepsis moves backward in time, prolepsis moves forward. It introduces events that will occur later in the story, thereby creating anticipation. A famous example appears in 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. The novel famously opens with the line, "Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was to remember." Here the reader is immediately projected into a future moment, the moment of execution, before the narrative returns to the character's childhood. This technique creates narrative tension because the reader already knows that the character will eventually face this fate. The narrative thus oscillates between past and future. 3. Duration, narrative speed. Genette also analyzes the relationship between story time and narrative time, which he calls duration. In other words, how much textual space is devoted to particular events. Different techniques produce different narrative speeds. Scene A scene occurs when narrative time closely approximates story time. A clear example appears in Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, particularly in the famous proposal scene between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. In this moment, The interaction unfolds largely through direct dialogue. Because the conversation is presented almost in real time, the reader experiences the emotional tension with dramatic immediacy. In contrast, a summary condenses long periods of time into a brief passage. For example, in David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, the years during which David works as a child laborer in London are summarized in a relatively small portion of the narrative. Here, extensive experiences are compressed so that the narrative can progress efficiently toward later developments. Ellipsis. An even more radical form of temporal compression is ellipsis, where certain periods of time are entirely omitted. Into the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, the section titled Time Passes condenses nearly 10 years into a short sequence. Major events, including deaths and the impact of war, are mentioned only briefly, sometimes even within parentheses. The narrative thus emphasizes the impersonal and relentless passage of time. Matter 4, frequency. Another important dimension of narrative concerns frequency, which refers to the relationship between how many times an event occurs in the story and how many times it is narrated. One notable form is iterative narration, where events that occur repeatedly are narrated only once. A classic example appears in Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Flaubert often describes Emma Bovary's repetitive daily routines, her boredom, her dissatisfaction, her provincial life, through a single descriptive passage that represents many similar days. This narrative technique effectively conveys the monotony of her existence. Number 5. Mood, focalization. Genette also analyzes narrative mood, particularly through the concept of focalization, which concerns the perspective through which information is presented. Zero focalization. In zero focalization, the narrator knows more than any individual character. An example appears in Middlemarch by George Eliot, where the narrator has access to the motives, emotions, and social circumstances of numerous characters. This omniscient perspective allows the narrative to offer extensive commentary on society. Internal focalization. In internal focalization, events are filtered through the consciousness of a particular character. This technique is prominent in Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. The narrative frequently moves through the thoughts and perceptions of characters such as Clarissa Dalloway or Septimus Smith. As a result, the reader experiences events through their psychological perspectives. External focalization. Finally, external focalization limits the narrative to observable behavior. A clear illustration appears in Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. The narrator reports only dialogue and visible actions. Emotional states are never explicitly described, forcing the reader to infer meaning from subtle cues. Chapter 6. Voice, the narrative instance. The final concept we will examine today concerns voice, which refers to the relationship between the narrator and the story world. Homodiegetic narrator. A homodiegetic narrator is a narrator who participates in the story as a character. An example appears in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The narrator, Nick Carraway, recounts the story while also participating in the events he describes. Autodiegetic narrator. An autodiegetic narrator is a special type of homodiegetic narrator in which the narrator is also the protagonist of the story. This structure appears again in Jane Eyre, where Jane narrates her own life story, recounting her personal development from childhood to adulthood. Concluding reflection. Through these concepts, story, narrative, narration, order, duration, frequency, mood, and voice, Genette provides a systematic framework for analyzing narrative structure. The essential insight is that novels do not merely tell stories. They construct complex narrative architectures that shape how readers perceive time, perspective, and meaning. Therefore, when analyzing a novel, the critical question is not only what happens, but also how the narrative chooses to tell it.